He ignored her when she walked in, but 10 minutes later, the room would forget how to breathe. The chandeliers above the Grand Astoria ballroom shimmered like frozen stars, casting soft gold light over a sea of tailored tuxedos and couture gowns, the low hum of polite conversation blending with the distant clink of crystal glasses. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, confident, composed, a man who had built his name on precision and control, his hand resting lightly on the arm of his fiancée, Victoria Hale, whose laughter rang just a little too brightly as she leaned into him, her diamond bracelet catching the light with every calculated movement. And for a moment, everything looked exactly as it should, polished, perfect, untouchable, until the doors opened again, quietly, almost unnoticed, and Clara Whitmore stepped inside. No one turned at first, no ripple of whispers, no shift in the air, just a woman in a simple navy dress, her heels soft against the marble floor, her posture straight but unassuming, as if she had already accepted the role they had written for her long ago, the one they never bothered to rewrite. And from across the room, Ethan saw her, his eyes passing over her the way one might glance at an old photograph left in a drawer, familiar but irrelevant, his expression barely flickering before he looked away, dismissing her presence with the ease of a man who had already decided she no longer belonged in his world. It hadn't always been like this, or at least that's what people liked to believe, but the truth was quieter, more complicated, buried in years of small dismissals and polished indifference, in conversations where her voice became background noise and decisions where her name was never spoken, until one day, she simply stopped being seen, and when their marriage ended, it wasn't with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet erasure, as if she had been edited out of a story that continued without her. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a formal announcement veiled as a charity gala, the unveiling of the late Theodore Blackwood's estate, a billionaire whose empire stretched across industries and continents, a man whose legacy had drawn the city's elite into this room like moths to light, and Ethan had positioned himself carefully within that glow, his firm one of the potential partners, to absorb pieces of the Blackwood holdings, his future expanding with every handshake, every measured smile, every calculated word, and beside him, Victoria played her part flawlessly, her voice dipping just low enough to sound intimate as she spoke to a circle of investors, her fingers tightening slightly on Ethan's arm when her gaze flicked, almost involuntarily, toward Clara standing near the back of the room, alone but unmoved. "Is that her?" Victoria murmured under her breath, her lips barely moving, and Ethan didn't bother to follow her gaze this time, his answer coming with a soft, dismissive exhale. "It doesn't matter." 3 words, light as air, final as a door closing. Across the ballroom, Clara let her eyes move slowly over the room, taking in the familiar patterns of power, the way people clustered around influence, the way laughter rose and fell depending on who was listening, and for a moment, her hand brushed lightly against the small silver clasp of her evening bag, a subtle, grounding gesture, as if reminding herself of something steady beneath the surface, something no one else could see. And near the far end of the room, a man in a dark suit, older, composed, his presence quiet but unmistakably authoritative, met her gaze and gave the smallest nod, a gesture so brief it could have been imagined, but it wasn't, and something in the air shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. The music softened, the conversations began to taper as attention slowly turned toward the stage where a tall podium stood beneath the glow of a single spotlight, and a voice, smooth and measured, echoed through the ballroom, calling for attention, calling for silence, calling for the moment everyone had been waiting for. And as the room adjusted, as the noise settled into anticipation, Clara took a single step forward, her expression calm, unreadable, and for the first time that evening, someone noticed. The voice at the podium was calm, deliberate, the kind of voice that carried authority without ever needing to rise. And as it echoed through the ballroom, conversations dissolved into silence, glasses paused midair, and every eye turned forward, drawn by the promise of something significant unfolding, while Clara remained still for half a breath longer before taking another step, then another, her heels tapping softly against the marble, a quiet rhythm that somehow cut through the stillness. And near the front, Ethan shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening as if reacting to something he could not yet name, though his gaze stayed fixed ahead, refusing to acknowledge the movement behind him, as though ignoring it might keep it from becoming real. "Ladies and gentlemen," the speaker began, his silver hair catching the light as he adjusted the papers in his hand. "Thank you for gathering tonight as we honor the legacy of Theodore Blackwood and proceed with the formal announcement of his estate's succession." And at the mention of the name, a ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but electric, the weight of billions of dollars hanging in the air like a held breath. Investors leaning slightly forward, alliances recalculating in silence. Futures shifting before a single name had even been spoken. Clara reached the center aisle just as the speaker paused, his eyes lifting from the document, and for a fraction of a second, their gazes met again, recognition passing between them like a quiet signal, and he gave the smallest nod before continuing. "As stipulated in Mr. Blackwood's final will and testament, all primary holdings, including Blackwood Industries, its subsidiaries, and associated assets, are to be transferred in full to a single designated heir," and the room seemed to lean closer, anticipation tightening like a wire, while beside Ethan, Victoria's fingers curled more firmly around his arm, her polished smile faltering at the edges as she scanned the faces around her, searching for certainty and finding none. "The sole beneficiary," the speaker continued, his voice steady, unhurried, "is to be recognized immediately upon confirmation of identity." And a brief pause followed, just long enough to sharpen the tension into something almost tangible, before he spoke again. "Miss Clara Whitmore." The name did not explode through the room. It sank, heavy and disorienting, as if no one quite understood what they had heard. And for a moment, nothing moved, no one spoke, the silence stretching thin and fragile until it nearly broke. And then Clara took one final step forward into the light. This time, the room saw her. The shift was immediate, heads turning, whispers igniting like sparks, the same people who had overlooked her minutes ago now staring openly, trying to reconcile the woman they had dismissed with the name that had just been spoken. And near the front, Ethan turned, slowly at first, then fully, his eyes locking onto her with a sharpness that had not been there before, confusion flickering across his face, followed by disbelief, as if he were looking at someone who resembled a memory but did not belong to it. "There must be some mistake," Victoria whispered, her voice tight, almost brittle, but the words did not travel far, swallowed by the growing murmur of the crowd, and Clara did not respond, did not rush, did not explain. She simply continued forward until she stood beside the podium, the light catching in her hair, her expression composed, her presence steady in a way that felt unshakable. "Do you confirm your identity as Clara Whitmore?" the speaker asked, his tone respectful, formal, and for the first time, the room held its breath not in anticipation, but in recognition of something irreversible, and Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "I do," she said, her voice calm, clear, carrying farther than she intended, and in that moment, the silence changed, no longer uncertain, but absolute, as if the entire room had just realized it had been looking at the wrong person all along. And across the distance, Ethan stared at her, really stared this time, searching for the woman he thought he knew, and finding none. The silence did not break, it settled, heavy and deliberate, like something the room was not ready to carry, and Clara felt it in the way the air shifted around her, in the way every gaze now followed her with a kind of careful attention that had not existed minutes ago, not admiration yet, not even respect, but recognition, the first fragile step toward both, and she did not rush it, she did not fill it with words. She simply stood there, steady, as the speaker extended a leather folder toward her, its edges worn from time, its contents holding the weight of a legacy that had just changed hands. "Please," he said quietly, his voice lowered now, almost private despite the hundreds watching, and Clara accepted the folder with both hands, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface, grounding herself in the reality of the moment, not the spectacle of it. And as she opened it, the soft rustle of paper seemed louder than it should have been, a small sound amplified by the stillness of the room, while behind her, whispers continued to spread, names. and numbers and assumptions colliding in hushed tones that rose and fell like distant waves. Ethan took a step forward before he realized he had moved at all, his body reacting before his thoughts could catch up, and Victoria's grip tightened on his arm, as if to anchor him in place. But he gently pulled free, his eyes never leaving Clara, confusion giving way to something sharper, something unsettled, as if the foundation he had been standing on all evening had shifted beneath him without warning. "Clara," he said, her name unfamiliar on his tongue now, not because he had forgotten it, but because it no longer belonged to the version of her he remembered, and the sound of it carried farther than he intended, drawing a few more heads in their direction. But she did not turn immediately. She finished signing where the speaker indicated, her signature precise, unhurried, each stroke deliberate, as though she had been preparing for this moment long before anyone else realized it was coming. When she finally closed the folder, she exhaled softly, a breath she had been holding for years, and only then did she turn. Their eyes met across a distance that felt wider than the room itself, and for the first time, Ethan saw no hesitation in her, no quiet apology, no attempt to soften herself for his comfort, only a calm, unwavering presence that made it impossible to look away, and something in his expression faltered, just slightly, the confidence he wore so easily earlier now edged with uncertainty. "I did not know," he began, the words sounding smaller than he expected, as though they did not quite belong in this new version of the story, and Clara tilted her head just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him, but not enough to invite more, her gaze steady, her silence intentional, and it said more than anything she could have spoken. Around them, the room continued to watch. Conversations paused mid-thought, glasses forgotten in hands, the collective attention narrowing to the space between them, waiting, expecting something louder, something dramatic, but Clara did not give them that. Instead, she took a single step toward him, close enough now that her voice did not need to carry, but clear enough that it still did. "You did not lose me," she said, her tone even, almost gentle, and Ethan's breath caught, the words landing before he could prepare for them. Before she finished, "You just chose not to see me." There was no anger in it, no accusation sharpened into a blade, only truth, simple and unadorned, and that was what made it impossible to deflect. And for a moment, Ethan had no response, no practiced line, no strategy to regain control, only the realization that whatever version of Clara he had once known no longer existed in front of him, if it had ever existed at all. She held his gaze for a second longer, not to challenge him, not to prove anything, but to close something quietly, something that no longer needed to remain open. And then she stepped back, turning toward the exit with the same calm composure she had carried since the beginning, the path parting for her now without hesitation, people shifting instinctively to make space, their earlier indifference replaced by something closer to reverence, or perhaps caution. And as she walked past the towering doors, the soft echo of her heels marking her departure, the room did not erupt into applause. It did not recover immediately. It simply remained still, as if trying to understand what had just happened, and near the center of it all, Ethan stood where she had left him, surrounded by everything he thought he controlled, and for the first time, it felt smaller than it ever had before. The doors closed behind Clara with a quiet finality, the soft click barely audible beneath the lingering silence inside the ballroom, yet it carried a weight that seemed to echo louder than any applause ever could, and for a moment, no one moved, as if the room itself needed time to catch up with what had just unfolded, the chandeliers still glowing, the music still waiting somewhere in the background, but everything else suspended, uncertain, recalibrating. Ethan remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on the space she had just left, as though expecting her to return, as though the moment could still be undone if he understood it quickly enough. And around him, the world he had so carefully constructed began to shift in ways he could not immediately control. Investors who had been leaning toward him now turned slightly away, their attention redirected, conversations restarting without him, quieter, sharper, threaded with new calculations that did not include his name in the same position it had held minutes before. Victoria was the first to recover, her posture straightening, her smile returning with practiced precision, though it did not reach her eyes, and she leaned closer to Ethan, her voice low but urgent. "We need to speak to them." Clarify this. There has to be more to the story. But Ethan did not move, her words skimming past him without landing, his mind still caught in the image of Clara standing in the light, composed, unshaken, entirely unfamiliar, and for the first time, the certainty he had always relied on felt distant, like something he could remember but no longer access. Across the room, the silver-haired speaker closed the folder and exchanged a quiet word with a group of attorneys, their expressions respectful, focused, already shifting toward the next phase of execution, because for them, this was not a spectacle, it was a transfer of power, clean and absolute, and Clara had already stepped into it without hesitation. The music resumed, softly at first, a tentative return to normalcy, but the rhythm felt different now. Conversations layered with a new awareness, guests glancing toward the doors as if expecting her to reappear, as if the absence she left behind was somehow more powerful than her presence had been, and near the edge of the room, a man in a tailored charcoal suit spoke quietly into his phone, his tone respectful, measured. Yes, she has confirmed, effective immediately, and the words carried. Just enough to be heard by those closest, sending another subtle ripple through the crowd. Ethan finally exhaled, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and when he moved, it was not toward the investors or the stage, but toward the exit, his steps slower than usual, less certain, as if each one required a decision he was no longer used to making. And Victoria followed, her heels clicking sharply behind him, her composure tightening with every step, because whatever control they thought they had over this evening had already slipped beyond reach. Outside, the night air was cooler, carrying the distant hum of the city, headlights passing in steady lines along the avenue, and Clara stood near the curb, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of a waiting car, the driver holding the door open with quiet deference. And for a moment, she did not get in. She simply stood there, looking out at the city as if seeing it from a different height, not above it, not removed from it, but no longer defined by it either. Ethan stopped several feet behind her, close enough to speak, far enough to hesitate. And when he finally did, his voice lacked the effortless confidence it once carried. "Clara," he said again, more carefully this time, as though the name itself required permission, and she turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge his presence without inviting him closer, her expression calm, unchanged. "I should have," he began, but the sentence faltered, unfinished, because whatever he had intended to say no longer fit the reality in front of him. And Clara did not help him find the words. She did not soften the silence for him the way she once might have. She simply let it remain, letting him sit in it, understand it on his own. The driver waited patiently, the door still open, the interior of the car warm and quiet. And after a brief moment, Clara stepped forward, her hand brushing lightly against the door as she paused one last time, not for him, not for the past, but for herself. And then she spoke, her voice steady, unhurried. "You taught me how to live without being seen," she said, her eyes meeting his for just a second longer. "I learned how to exist without needing to be." And with that, she slipped into the car, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Ethan standing on the sidewalk beneath the city lights, surrounded by everything he once believed defined success, and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that none of it had ever truly been enough. The car pulled away from the curb with a smooth, effortless glide, its dark silhouette merging into the steady stream of city lights, and Clara did not look back, not through the tinted window, not through memory, not even in thought, because the version of herself that once would have turned, searching for something unfinished, no longer existed. And as the city unfolded before her in long ribbons of light and shadow, she leaned back against the leather seat, her fingers resting lightly in her lap, steady now, no longer trembling, no longer bracing for impact. Inside the ballroom, the illusion of control continued to fracture in quieter, more insidious ways, the kind that did not announce themselves but lingered in glances and shifting alliances, and Ethan felt it immediately as he stepped back inside. The warmth of the room no longer welcoming but altered, as though the space had recalibrated its hierarchy in his absence. Conversations that once opened for him now paused just a second too long. Smiles that once held certainty now carried polite distance. and he moved through it all with a composure that felt increasingly like performance, rather than instinct. Victoria stayed close, her voice low and controlled as she tried to reassemble the narrative. "We can recover this. People just need context. We will set the story straight." But even as she spoke, her eyes tracked the room with a sharper awareness, noticing who had already turned their attention elsewhere, who was no longer waiting for Ethan to lead, and for the first time, the certainty she wore like armor showed a faint, almost imperceptible crack. Near the far side of the ballroom, the group of attorneys had begun speaking with a select circle of guests, their tone measured, their posture unmistakably deferential. And though Clara was no longer physically present, her influence lingered, tangible and immediate, as decisions began to form around her name, not Ethan's, and that shift, subtle as it was, landed with more force than any public confrontation ever could. Ethan stopped near the edge of the room, his gaze drifting briefly toward the stage, then away, as if the center of attention no longer belonged to him. And a memory surfaced without warning, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and precise. Clara standing in their kitchen years ago, sunlight catching in her hair as she spoke about something he had not fully listened to, her voice steady, her presence patient, and he realized, with a clarity that felt almost disorienting, that he had not lost her in a single moment. He had overlooked her in 1,000 small ones, each one so insignificant at the time that he never thought to remember them, and now they returned, one by one, impossible to ignore. Outside, the city moved forward without hesitation, traffic lights shifting from red to green, people crossing sidewalks with purpose, the world continuing as it always did, and Clara watched it all with a quiet sense of distance, not detachment, but perspective, as if she had stepped out of a story that once defined her and into one she now controlled, not through force or declaration, but through presence, through the quiet certainty of knowing exactly where she stood. Her phone vibrated softly against the seat beside her, a single message lighting up the screen, and when she glanced at it, her expression did not change, but something in her eyes settled, a confirmation rather than a surprise, the kind that comes from plans long in motion finally aligning with reality. And she set the phone aside without responding, because there was nothing urgent left to prove, nothing immediate left to secure. Everything that mattered had already been set into motion long before tonight. Back at the gala, Ethan stood among the people who had once mirrored his confidence, and for the first time, he felt the absence of something he had never valued when it was within reach, not power, not influence, but clarity, the simple understanding of what truly mattered. And as the music swelled again and conversations resumed around him, he remained still, caught between what he had built and what he had failed to see, realizing that the most significant shift of the evening had not been announced from the stage, but had walked quietly out the door, leaving behind a silence that no amount of control could fill. By the time the car turned onto Fifth Avenue, the city had settled into its late evening rhythm, the kind that hummed quietly beneath the surface, steady and indifferent, and Clara watched it through the window as reflections of passing streetlights traced soft lines across the glass, her expression calm, her thoughts no longer circling the past, but moving forward with a clarity that felt earned, not sudden, not accidental, but built over years of silence that had once been mistaken for weakness. The driver glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, his tone respectful. "We will arrive in 12 minutes, Ms. Whitmore." And she gave a small nod, her gaze returning to the skyline, where towers of glass and steel stood illuminated against the dark, each one a testament to power, ambition, and the quiet decisions that shaped both. And somewhere within that skyline, a new chapter had already begun, one that did not require announcement, only presence. Back at the ballroom, the evening attempted to recover its rhythm, but the shift was irreversible, the kind that did not fade with music or conversation, and Ethan found himself moving through it as though slightly out of step, his instincts no longer aligning with the reactions around him, as if the rules he had relied on had been rewritten without his consent, and every interaction now required a recalibration he was not prepared for. A senior partner from one of the largest investment firms approached him, his expression polite, measured, but his tone carried a new distance. "Quite a development tonight," he said, adjusting his cufflink with deliberate precision. We will be revisiting our projections in light of the announcement. And though the words were neutral, their meaning was not, and Ethan understood it immediately. Opportunities that had once seemed certain now shifting beyond his reach, not through confrontation, but through quiet redirection. Of course, Ethan replied, his voice steady, controlled, but it lacked the effortless confidence that had defined him earlier, and the partner gave a small nod before stepping away, his attention already turning elsewhere, toward conversations that now carried greater weight, and none of them included Ethan at the center. Victoria watched the exchange from a few steps away, her posture still composed, but her eyes sharper now, calculating, and when she moved toward him, her voice was softer, more controlled than before. We need to speak with the legal team, understand the structure of this transfer. There may still be leverage. But even as she said it, the certainty behind her words felt thinner, stretched against a reality that was already solidifying without their input. Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting toward the entrance once more, not expecting Clara to return, but unable to fully accept that she would not. And in that moment, something settled within him, not regret in the dramatic sense, not a sudden collapse of everything he believed, but a quieter realization, more precise, more difficult to dismiss, that the version of control he had relied on had always been conditional, dependent on what he chose to see and what he chose to ignore. And tonight, that balance had shifted in a way he could not reverse. The car slowed to a stop in front of a private residence set back from the street, its architecture understated but unmistakably refined, the kind of place that did not announce its value but carried it in every detail. And as the driver stepped out to open the door, Clara gathered her coat, her movements unhurried, grounded, and when she stepped onto the sidewalk, the air felt cooler, sharper, carrying the faint scent of rain that had not yet fallen. The doors opened before she reached them, a quiet acknowledgement of her arrival, and inside, the space was warm, softly lit, designed not to impress but to endure, and as she crossed the threshold, she paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but recognition of where she had been and where she stood now. And for the first time in a long time, there was no need to prove anything, no need to be seen in a certain way, because the truth no longer depended on who was looking. And somewhere, across the city, in a room still filled with light and noise, Ethan stood among the remnants of an evening that had not gone as planned, realizing that the most powerful shift had not been loud, had not demanded attention, but had unfolded quietly, in the space he had once overlooked and now could no longer ignore. The house was quieter than the city, not silent, but intentionally calm, the kind of stillness that did not press in on you but allowed you to breathe. And as Clara stepped fully inside, the door closing softly behind her, the world she had just left seemed to fall away with a clarity that felt almost surreal, as though it had belonged to someone else, someone she had once been but no longer needed to become again. A woman in her late 60s approached from the adjoining room, her posture straight, her expression warm but composed, the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed far more than she ever said aloud. And when she spoke, her voice carried a familiarity that did not require explanation. "You handled it exactly as he believed you would," she said, and Clara allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to surface, not pride, not relief, but recognition of a plan fulfilled not through force, but through patience. "He always trusted timing more than words," Clara replied, her tone soft, reflective, and the older woman nodded, as if that had always been the point. The room around them was lined with shelves of leather-bound books, the faint scent of polished wood and old paper lingering in the air, a space that felt lived in rather than displayed, and Clara moved toward the window, her reflection briefly catching in the glass, not as a question, but as confirmation, and for a moment, she allowed herself to stand still, to feel the weight of what had just shifted, not in the world outside, but within herself. Across the city, the gala continued, but its center had already changed, and Ethan could feel it in the way conversations no longer paused when he approached, in the way attention drifted past him rather than toward him, and for the first time in years, he was not the axis around which the room turned. He was simply part of it, and that realization settled slowly, deliberately, leaving no room for denial. He stepped away from the main floor, moving toward a quieter corridor lined with framed photographs of past events, his reflection briefly visible in the glass as he passed, and he stopped without intending to, his gaze catching on his own image, composed, successful, unchanged, and yet something in it felt unfamiliar, as though the version of himself he had relied on no longer aligned with the reality he had just witnessed. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a series of messages lighting up the screen, analysts, partners, inquiries already forming around the announcement, each one precise, professional, and beneath it all, urgent, because the shift had not gone unnoticed. It had already begun to ripple outward, affecting decisions far beyond the walls of the ballroom, and Ethan read them without responding, the words blurring slightly as his focus drifted elsewhere. Back in the house, Clara sat at a long table near the window, a folder placed carefully in front of her, the same one she had signed earlier, now no longer symbolic, but real, tangible, and she opened it again, not to confirm what she already knew, but to acknowledge it fully, page by page, detail by detail, understanding the scope of what had been entrusted to her, not as a surprise, but as a continuation of something that had been building long before tonight. He did not leave it to you because of what you became, the older woman said quietly, standing just behind her. He left it to you because of who you were when no one was watching. And Clara closed the folder. Gently, her fingers resting on its cover for a moment longer, the words settling into something deeper than validation, something closer to truth. Outside, the city lights continued to glow, unchanged, indifferent to individual stories, and yet within that vast, moving landscape, something had shifted quietly, a recalibration of power, of perception, of presence, and Clara stood, walking once more toward the window, her reflection steady, unbroken, not searching, not uncertain, simply there, and for the first time, that was enough. Morning arrived without ceremony, the light slipping quietly through the tall windows of the house, soft and pale at first, then gradually warming the edges of the room as the city outside began its steady ascent into another day. And Clara was already awake, standing near the window in a simple silk robe, her hair loosely gathered at the nape of her neck, her posture relaxed but alert, as if rest had not dulled her focus but refined it, and for a moment, she simply watched the skyline shift. From shadow to clarity, the glass towers catching sunlight one by one, each reflection a reminder that the world moved forward regardless of who claimed it. The folder lay open on the table behind her, pages neatly aligned, signatures precise, every line now more than ink, more than legal language. It was structure, responsibility, and possibility, all intertwined, and she turned back toward it, not with hesitation, but with intention, her steps measured as she returned to the table, her fingers tracing lightly over the margin of the top page before lifting it again, reviewing not out of doubt, but out of ownership. The board will expect your presence by noon, the older woman said from the doorway, her tone calm, already aligned with the rhythm of what came next, and Clara nodded once, absorbing the timing, the expectation, the weight of the room she would soon enter, a different kind of stage, one without chandeliers or whispered speculation, but no less significant, and perhaps far less forgiving. Across the city, Ethan stood in his office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that once felt expansive, commanding, but this morning it felt distant, as though the space between him and everything he could see had widened overnight, and his desk, usually ordered with precision, now held a scattering of documents, projections revised and re-revised, each one reflecting the same quiet shift, opportunities redirected, partnerships reconsidered, the absence of control more visible in the margins than in the numbers themselves. His assistant stood just inside the doorway, her voice careful, professional. There have been 3 requests to postpone meetings this week, and 2 inquiries regarding your position on the Blackwood transition. And Ethan nodded slowly, the words registering without surprise, as though he had already anticipated them, and yet hearing them aloud made the change feel more concrete, less theoretical, and he dismissed her with a brief gesture, turning back toward the window, his reflection, faintly visible against the glass, layered over the city he no longer felt entirely aligned with. Back in the house, Clara had changed into a tailored ivory suit, the fabric structured but fluid, moving with her rather than defining her. And as she fastened the final button, she paused for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but awareness of the moment she was stepping into, of the shift from observer to decision-maker. And when she reached for her coat, her movements were steady, deliberate, free of the hesitation that once accompanied spaces where she felt unseen. The car was waiting outside, the same quiet efficiency as the night before, and as she stepped into it, the door closing with a soft, final sound, the city once again unfolded before her. But this time, it did not feel like something to navigate. It felt like something to shape. At precisely 12 o'clock, the boardroom doors opened, a long polished table stretching across the space, glass walls framing a panoramic view of the skyline. And conversations paused as Clara entered, not abruptly, but with a controlled awareness, the kind that acknowledges presence without announcing it. And one by one, the members of the board turned toward her, their expressions composed, professional, but beneath it, attentive, measuring, and Clara did not rush to fill the silence. She walked to the head of the table, placed her folder down with quiet precision, and took her seat, her gaze steady as it moved across the room, meeting each set of eyes without hesitation. And for the first time, there was no question of whether she belonged there, because the answer no longer depended on them. No one spoke immediately after she sat down, not because they did not know what to say, but because they were recalibrating how to say it, the subtle shift of power in the room already dictating a different tone, a different rhythm, and Clara allowed that silence to exist, not rushing to fill it, not offering reassurance, simply letting it settle into something honest, something that did not need performance to sustain it. The man seated to her right, a senior board member with decades of experience etched into the lines of his face, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat softly, his voice measured, respectful. "Miss Whitmore, on behalf of the board, we extend our acknowledgement of your position and welcome you." And the wording was precise, carefully chosen, not overly warm, not distant, but aligned with a reality that could no longer be questioned. And Clara inclined her head slightly in response, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she said, her tone calm, composed, neither seeking approval nor rejecting it, simply accepting the moment for what it was. A series of documents were placed before her, each one outlining structures, responsibilities, timelines, and Clara reviewed them with a focus that was both immediate and practiced, her eyes moving across the pages with quiet efficiency, absorbing not just the content, but the intent behind it. And as she turned the first page, she spoke, her voice clear, cutting gently through the room without force. "Before we proceed, I would like to understand the current state of operational alignment across divisions." And the shift was immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable, the room responding not to her title, but to her presence, to the clarity of her question, to the fact that she was not there to observe, but to engage. Across the table, another board member leaned forward slightly, his tone more attentive now. "There have been transitional delays in two sectors, primarily due to pending approvals that were expected under previous negotiations." And Clara nodded once, processing the information, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the document. "Then we will not proceed under those assumptions," she said, her voice even, her words precise. "We will reassess based on current authority and redefine the timeline accordingly." And there was no hesitation in her delivery, no need to emphasize the authority behind it, because it was already understood. The room adjusted again, more subtly this time, but with greater permanence, as if a new center had been established. And everyone present was now aligning to it. And Clara continued, not with urgency, but with intention, moving through each point with a measured clarity that left little room for ambiguity, her questions direct, her decisions grounded, not in reaction, but in understanding. Outside the glass walls, the city moved as it always did, traffic flowing, people crossing streets, buildings reflecting light, unaware of the decisions being made within, and yet those decisions would ripple outward, shaping outcomes far beyond this room. And Clara was aware of that, not as pressure, but as responsibility, something she carried not visibly, but steadily. Across town, Ethan sat alone in his office. The noise of the city filtered through glass, muted, distant, and the reports on his desk remained untouched. his attention no longer on projections or negotiations, but on something less tangible, less defined, the quiet realization that control had never been about holding everything in place, but about understanding what truly mattered, and in that understanding, he recognized what had been absent, not from the room, not from the deal, but from himself. Back in the boardroom, Clara closed the final document and looked up, her gaze moving across the faces around her, not searching for agreement, but acknowledging presence, and for a brief moment, the room held still again, not in uncertainty, but in recognition of something fully established, and when she spoke next, her voice was softer, but no less certain. We move forward from here. And it was not a statement of intention, it was a fact. The meeting did not end with applause, nor with any dramatic declaration. It concluded the way true shifts of power often do, quietly, efficiently, as decisions were noted, responsibilities reassigned, and the room gradually returned to motion. But something fundamental had already changed, something that would not revert once the chairs were empty and the doors closed behind them. Clara remained seated a moment longer after the others began to rise, her hands resting lightly on the polished surface of the table, her gaze steady, not lingering on any one person, but taking in the space as a whole, as if imprinting the moment not for validation, but for clarity. And when she finally stood, there was no hesitation in her movement, only continuity, as though she had always belonged in that position, even before anyone else had recognized it. One by one, the board members approached her, their words formal but genuine, acknowledgments that carried more weight now than they would have hours ago, and Clara received them with a composed nod, not dismissing, not indulging, simply meeting each exchange with the same quiet steadiness that had defined her presence from the moment she entered. As the room cleared, the older woman who had greeted her the night before stepped inside, her expression unchanged, but her eyes holding a deeper understanding of what had just taken place. He would have approved, she said softly, and Clara allowed that to settle without immediate response, because approval was no longer the measure she used, not for herself, not for what came next. Outside, the afternoon light stretched across the city, sharper now, more defined, and as Clara stepped out of the building, the air carried a faint warmth, the kind that signals transition, not arrival, and her car was already waiting, the door opening before she reached it. But she paused briefly on the steps, her gaze lifting toward the skyline, not searching, not questioning, simply observing, and in that moment, there was no urgency in her, no need to prove that she could hold what had been given, because she already was. Across town, Ethan sat in the same chair he had occupied for years, but the space felt altered in a way he could not ignore, not because anything visible had changed, but because his perception of it had. And the reports in front of him remained untouched, their numbers precise, their projections carefully constructed, but they no longer held the same certainty they once did, and he leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting toward the window, where the city continued its rhythm, indifferent to individual outcomes, and for the first time, he allowed himself to sit in the realization without immediately trying to correct it, to strategize it, to turn it into something actionable. His phone buzzed again, another message, another update, but he did not reach for it right away. Instead, his thoughts returned, not to the boardroom, not to the deal, but to Clara, to the way she had stood, the way she had spoken, the absence of hesitation, and more than that, the absence of need. And he understood now, in a way he had not before, that what unsettled him was not her position, not the inheritance, not the shift in power, but the fact that she had arrived there without him, without needing anything from the life they once shared, and that realization carried a quiet weight that no negotiation could resolve. Back on the steps, Clara stepped into the car, the door closing with the same soft finality as before, and as the vehicle pulled into the flow of traffic, she did not look back at the building, because the moment she had just left did not require revisiting. It had already become part of something larger, something ongoing. And as the city moved around her, unchanged yet entirely different, she allowed herself a single, quiet breath, not of relief, but of alignment, the kind that comes when the path ahead no longer needs to be questioned, only walked, and somewhere behind her, in offices and boardrooms and conversations yet to unfold, her presence would continue to shift outcomes, not through force, not through noise, but through the same quiet certainty that had carried her this far and would carry her further still. The days that followed did not announce themselves as a turning point. They unfolded quietly, each one building on the last with a steady, deliberate rhythm, and Clara moved through them with a focus that did not waver, her presence now woven into meetings, decisions, and conversations that once existed far beyond her reach. And yet she did not treat them as something new, not entirely, because in many ways, she had already been preparing for this long before anyone else had realized it. In the main office of Blackwood Industries, her name began to carry weight in subtle but undeniable ways. Schedules adjusted around her availability, reports refined with greater precision before reaching her desk, and conversations shifted tone the moment she entered, not out of obligation, but recognition, the kind that grows from consistency rather than declaration. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, her words carried clarity, not excess. And people learned quickly that she did not repeat herself, she did not fill silence unnecessarily, and she did not make decisions to impress, only to move forward. Across town, Ethan's world continued its own adjustment, though it felt less like forward movement and more like realignment, the kind that strips away assumptions one layer at a time, and each morning, he arrived at his office with the same routine, the same suit, the same measured pace. But the reception was no longer identical. There was a subtle hesitation in certain greetings, a recalculation in tone, and though nothing was said outright, the shift was unmistakable, the space he once occupied without question now requiring effort to maintain. Victoria adapted quickly, her instincts sharp, her approach strategic, positioning herself in conversations that could stabilize what had begun to drift, but even she could not fully restore what had already been altered. Because the change had not been external, it had been structural, rooted in something deeper than perception alone. One afternoon, as the city moved through its usual cadence of traffic and noise, Ethan found himself standing outside a building he had not visited in years, a smaller structure tucked between larger ones. Unremarkable at first glance, but familiar in a way that caught him off guard, and without fully deciding to, he stepped inside. The hallway was quiet, lined with simple doors and soft lighting, and as he moved down it, memory surfaced not in fragments, but in continuity. Clara sitting at a desk, focused, absorbed in her work, her presence steady even when overlooked, and he paused at the end of the corridor, the realization settling not as a sudden revelation, but as something that had been waiting to be acknowledged, that what he had dismissed as small had never actually been so. Back in her office, Clara reviewed a series of proposals, her attention precise, her posture relaxed but engaged, and as she set one document aside, her phone rang, the number unfamiliar, but the timing deliberate, and she answered without hesitation, her voice calm. Clara Whitmore. And there was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a voice she recognized, not immediately, but clearly enough. "It is Ethan," he said, and the words hung there for a moment, not heavy, not urgent, just present, and Clara did not respond right away, not out of uncertainty, but choice, allowing the space between them to exist as it was, unfilled, unforced. "I wanted to speak with you," he continued, his tone measured, stripped of its usual confidence, and Clara turned slightly toward the window, the city stretching out beyond the glass, unchanged and yet entirely different from the perspective she now held, and when she finally spoke, her voice was even, steady. "Then speak," she said, not inviting, not rejecting, simply allowing the moment to unfold without altering it. And for the first time, Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by what he wanted to say, but by what she chose to hear. There was a pause on the line, not empty, but weighted, the kind of silence that reveals more than it hides, and Clara remained still by the window, her gaze resting on the horizon where the city blurred into distance, her reflection faint against the glass, steady, unchanged, as if nothing in her required adjustment to meet this moment. Ethan exhaled softly on the other end, a sound that carried none of the control he once wore so easily, and when he spoke again, his words came slower, more deliberate, as though each one had to be chosen rather than assumed. "I was wrong," he said, and the statement did not arrive with drama or emphasis. It simply existed, plain and unadorned, and Clara listened without interruption, without reaction, allowing the words to settle where they would. Not just about tonight, he continued, his voice quieter now. About everything I thought I understood. And there was a slight shift in his tone, something less defined, less certain, and for a moment, it was clear that he was not speaking to change her mind, but to understand his own. Clara did not turn from the window, her hand resting lightly against the cool surface of the glass, grounding, present, and when she finally spoke, her voice was even, almost gentle, but not softened by sentiment. Understanding comes after you stop needing to be right, she said, and the words landed without force, without accusation, simply placed between them as truth, and Ethan was silent again, not because he disagreed, but because there was nothing immediate to answer with. Outside, the city moved forward in its steady rhythm, cars passing, people crossing intersections, lives continuing without pause. And within that movement, Clara felt no urgency, no pull to revisit what had already been resolved, not because it did not matter, but because it no longer defined what came next. I thought if I could speak to you, Ethan said after a moment, it might change something. And there was a faint hesitation in the final words, as if even he was unsure what that something was meant to be. Clara let the silence stretch just long enough for the intention behind his words to become clear, and then she answered, her tone unchanged, her clarity intact. It already has, she said, and he waited, the quiet on the line sharpening. But not in the way you mean. There was no cruelty in her voice, no edge, only certainty. And it was that certainty that made the distance between them feel complete, not abrupt, not fractured, but finished. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the weight of her words settling into something he could not argue with. And for the first time, he did not try to redirect the conversation, did not search for a way to reshape it into something more familiar. He simply accepted it as it was. I did not see you, he said quietly, the admission more precise now, less about regret and more about recognition. And Clara allowed herself a small breath, not of relief, but of acknowledgement, because that truth, once spoken, did not need to be repeated. No, she replied softly, you did not. And there was no bitterness in it, only closure. The line remained open for a moment longer, neither of them speaking, not out of hesitation, but because there was nothing left to add. And finally, Ethan spoke once more, his voice steadier now, though not the same as before. I hope you build something extraordinary, he said. And this time, the words were not about reclaiming anything, not about reaching back, but about stepping aside. And Clara turned slightly from the window, her reflection shifting with her, her presence fully aligned with where she stood. I already am, she answered, and there was no need to elaborate, no need to explain, because the truth of it existed in everything she had become, everything she had stepped into, and everything she would continue to shape. And when the call ended, it did not feel like something lost. It felt like something completed, a chapter closed not with noise, but with quiet certainty, leaving only the path ahead, clear and entirely her own. The city did not pause for endings, it never had, and as evening settled once more over the skyline, the lights returned in quiet succession, windows glowing, streets alive with motion, everything continuing as it always did. And yet for Clara, something had shifted in a way that did not need acknowledgement, only continuation. She stood once again by the window in her office, now no longer a place she was stepping into, but a space she had already shaped, her reflection steady against the glass, not searching, not questioning, simply present. And below, the movement of the city felt less like something to navigate and more like something she understood, not completely, not perfectly, but enough. The days had settled into a rhythm, meetings that began on time and ended with clarity, decisions that carried weight but not hesitation, and conversations that no longer required her to prove her place within them, because that question had already been answered, not in a single moment, but in every quiet step that led here. The board no longer watched her to assess, they listened to understand, and that distinction, subtle as it was, marked the difference between being accepted and being established. And Clara moved within that space with the same calm precision that had carried her from the beginning, never louder than necessary, never smaller than she needed to be. Across town, Ethan walked out of his office later than usual, the building behind him still lit, still active, but no longer centered around him in the way it once had been. And as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the air carried a faint chill, the kind that arrives with change, not sudden, but steady, and he paused for a moment, not because he had nowhere to go, but because for the first time in a long while, he was not rushing toward anything. He was simply standing still within it. He thought of the conversation, of the words that had not been argued, not reshaped, just accepted, and there was a clarity in that acceptance, not comfortable, not easy, but real, and he understood now that some things were not meant to be reclaimed, only recognized, and in that recognition, something within him settled, not resolved, but honest. Back in her office, Clara turned from the window and walked toward her desk, a new set of documents waiting, a new set of decisions already forming, and she did not hesitate. She did not linger on what had been closed, because her focus had already moved forward, not as an escape, but as a continuation of something she had chosen fully. The city lights reflected softly across the surface of her desk, a quiet reminder of the scale beyond the room, and she reached for the first document, her hand steady, her movements unforced, and as she began to read, there was no sense of arrival, no moment of finality, only the understanding that this was not the end of anything, but the beginning of everything she would now build, shape, and define on her own terms. Outside, the night deepened, the rhythm of the city constant, unchanging, and somewhere within it, two lives moved forward on different paths, no longer intersecting, no longer defined by what they once were to each other, and that separation did not feel like loss. It felt like truth, quiet, complete, and unshakable. Clara did not seek revenge. She did not return to prove anything. She simply became something undeniable, something that did not need recognition to exist. And as she continued her work, the world around her adjusted accordingly, not because she demanded it, but because she no longer needed to ask, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of memory and expectation, the past remained exactly where it belonged, behind her, while everything ahead unfolded with a clarity that required no permission, only presence, and in that presence, she had already won.